Aimee Semple McPherson was a prominent church leader in the 1900s and would become the founder of the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. Her new approach to ministry, along with her amazing charisma, would make her sermons and productions known around the world. From being one of the first women to ever preach on the radio, to being the face of a movement that would number over 8.8 million members worldwide today, her name would become synonymous with a new way of preaching the gospel, and her work would help feed millions of the most at-risk members of her society. Stay tuned as we look at how a female pastor in the early 1900s used progressive teaching methods to preach a conservative gospel, and how she made headlines around the world when she was kidnapped and escaped a desert shack, only to come back to people claiming she had lied about the whole situation. Amy Elizabeth Kennedy was born October 9, 1890 in Salford, Ontario, to Father James Morgan and Mother Mildred Ona Pierce. Amy was raised in a Christian household with her Methodist father and a mother who worked in the Salvation Army soup kitchen. Early on, Amy began to rebel against her parents by doing such things as reading novels, attending movies, and going to dances. Her rebellion, if you even want to call it that, ended when she began learning about the theory of evolution in school. Although she was questioning both faith and science, when she began questioning the necessity to teach the theory of evolution in school, she quickly made a name for herself. She wrote to a Canadian newspaper questioning the taxpayer-funded teaching of evolution. At this time in Canada, the teaching about evolution had just recently taken into effect, and so her questions quickly gained a lot of attention. This attention would help steer her thoughts back toward the idea of exploring her own faith. In 1907, at the age of 17, she was attending a revival when she was introduced to Robert James Semple. Robert was a Pentecostal missionary from Ireland preaching at revival meetings in the area. Amy became enthralled by Semple's message and was led to dedicate herself to Jesus and convert to Pentecostalism. But it wasn't just the message she was enraptured by. In August 1908, after a time of courtship, Amy and Robert married in a Salvation Army ceremony. The couple moved to Chicago with James supporting the couple by working in a foundry and preaching on the weekend. During their time in Chicago, they began attending William Durham's Full Gospel Assembly. His teachings of progressive sanctification and speaking in tongues would go on to be important statements of belief in Amy's later teachings. William and Amy enjoyed reading and studying the Bible together. As they both continued to take part in spreading the gospel locally, they decided to embark on mission work overseas. They were able to take part in an evangelistic tour of China to spread the gospel, but both Amy and William contracted malaria. They both fell ill, but Semple contracted dysentery and would go on to pass away in Hong Kong. Amy was left overseas and pregnant, dealing with malaria. She would go on to have a daughter, Roberta Semple, overseas, and would thankfully recover shortly afterward. When she returned to the States, she moved to New York City to join her mother Mildred. She once again began helping with the Salvation Army, but shortly after she met an accountant by the name of Harold Stewart McPherson. They married in 1912 and moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where they had a son in 1913 named Rolfe Kennedy McPherson. Amy began to take on a housewife role with her two young children and Harold as the breadwinner. But as time went on, she felt she was rejecting her calling to be preaching to the people. These inner thoughts became exemplified when she became emotionally distressed and, in 1914, became ill with appendicitis. This led to her being in immense pain constantly. It never did stop until a voice came to her and told her that she must go and preach as a full-time job. She said that once she had made the decision to follow the voice, her pain went away. She then decided that she would go out and begin traveling and speaking at gatherings like her first husband had. After she had healed up, she took the kids and ran off to preach the gospel. It was in 1915 when she preached her first official sermon in Mount Forest, Ontario. It seemed to have gone well. But Harold, when he found out about where his wife was, made his way to track her down and bring her back home. However, when Harold met up with Amy, she was able to convince him to follow her and go on a circuit preaching the gospel. Harold was a Christian himself, but he had never had intentions of making this his life. However, after joining up, he sold their house and they went on tour living out of their, quote, gospel car, which they used to drive around and preach the gospel. Aimee began touring the southern United States, speaking at churches and meetings along the Sawdust Trail. She drew much attention when, in 1916 at a meeting, she performed a healing on a woman who was in an advanced stage of rheumatoid arthritis. Aimee laid hands on the woman and she reportedly walked right out of the church without crutches. She began publishing a magazine she named Bridal Call, where she spoke about women's role in the church and taught about the relationship between Jesus and Christians as a marriage bond. She also used the magazine to publish her sermons and kept her followers up to date with the ministry she was doing. Although things were finally coming together for Aimee, her ministry started to take a role on her relationship with Harold. After 3 years of traveling ministry, Aimee and Harold separated, with Harold heading back to New York and Aimee heading to the West Coast and settling in Los Angeles. Her mother, who helped on and off with the ministry, moved with her to Los Angeles and began helping Aimee reach a larger audience. They began their ministry in Los Angeles by renting out the newly built Los Angeles Philharmonic Auditorium, which had 3,500 seats and drew large crowds. It was also around this time that Aimee became ordained as an evangelist by the Assemblies of God USA. Where the presence of speaking in tongues and the moving of the Holy Spirit in the crowd, the meetings were quite a show to see. The crowd continued to grow and her following became so supportive that they built a home for Aimee to stay officially in Los Angeles. LA at the time was mostly just a vacation spot, but this city allowed Aimee the opportunity to preach to many tourists who would take her message back to their hometowns, which led to her becoming known around the US. Although she had originally taken up housing in LA to cut down on her travels, the way that her name was being spread meant that she was being asked to travel once again. It was around this time as well that the plans for a permanent place of worship were starting to be discussed. As she traveled, she began to start strategically presenting her theological and philosophical approach to ministry. She slowly parted ways with the Pentecostal group Assembly of God USA, officially separating in 1922. She did not want her movement to be associated with a specific denomination. Rather, she wanted to work with several different groups for the betterment of her movement. In addition, she began presenting her message of the four-part gospel, which we will discuss later in this video. But she was able to put the final plans together for her church. She had originally set a goal of $5,000, which is about $88,000 today. But all of her efforts in raising money paid off with way more than that, and her plans changed to create a true megachurch, one of the first of its kind in America. Her budget for the church ballooned to $250,000, which today equates to about $4.4 million. The new church would be called the Angelus Temple and would be built in the Echo Park district of Los Angeles. Showing her continual effort to bridge gaps and grow beyond any specific groups, the cornerstone inscription reads, "Dedicated unto the cause of interdenominational and worldwide evangelism." The temple was one of the largest constructions in America, with it rising to 125 feet from the main floor and having a dome 125 feet wide. It was opened with a seating capacity of 5,300 people, which seemed to be full all day, every day, according to its participants. There seemed to be a slight shift in the way that Aimee's preaching was done when moving into the temple. There began to be fewer Pentecostal elements in her services, and in reference to the cornerstone, she began to move away from any denominational affiliation and focus more on a new way of presenting the gospel that many would refer to as cinematic sermons. She would begin to co-opt many of the types of presentations that were being made popular in Hollywood at the time. She embraced large, 100-member choirs, putting on huge show performances, often using members of Hollywood as actors. She also began preaching more topical sermons, using situations from her life and popular cultural situations of the time. The presentation at Angelus Temple would not be too far off from what you would currently see in megachurches across America today. But it seemed that everything she was doing was working. Her audience was growing exponentially, and her impact on the lives and community of not only Los Angeles, but around the world was making her message even more popular. Recognizing her growing influence, she decided to open an institute for training men and women to equip them with the knowledge and abilities that she had found helpful in growing the way she had. It would originally be called the Foursquare Bible Institute, today known as Life Pacific University. The organization would help equip many of the leaders that would plant other churches under the teachings of Aimee across the United States. Many would also become integral in the outreach that the temple would conduct locally and internationally. She continued to try to expand her outreach in 1924 when she became the first woman to be granted a broadcast license by the Department of Commerce. She used this platform to preach sermons and expand her influence with her teachings. She would also use this platform to start presenting more fully some of the ideas that would go on to define the church. One concept she spoke about was against the teaching of Darwinian evolution, even going on to publicly support William Jennings Bryan during the Scopes trial. But as she was still on the rise, a major life event would happen that, although it would capture the attention of the media, would not necessarily end in the most positive way possible. For clarification, an entire video could be made on this situation, but I will make it as detailed and as brief as necessary for the context of this biography. On May 18, 1926, Aimee had gone to Ocean Park Beach in Santa Monica, California for a swim. Chaos, however, erupted when she abruptly went missing with no evidence left behind of where she went. The police were quickly called and a search of the beach and the water began. The search group included professional divers, police members, and numerous volunteers from the Angelus Temple and its different organizations. After several days, there was still no sign of what had happened to Aimee. Unfortunately, in the chaos, it was reported that 2 individuals drowned while searching. With these deaths and no evidence found, the search ended, and the official answer was that Aimee Semple McPherson had drowned and passed away in the water. This official answer, however, did not stop the public from trying to find answers. There were reported sightings of Aimee all across the U.S. and its borders. Many of these seemed so genuine that, in one case, a group of detectives drove all the way to Canada based upon a supposed positive ID, only to find a woman who was not Aimee. It wasn't just the LAPD who believed she had passed away. After several weeks of no updates, her mother, Mildred, reported officially that she believed her daughter to have passed away at the beach. Still, she received many ransom letters stating that they had had her daughter and were requesting different sums of money. Of course, none of these would be real. However, many of them would still show up in the media. But everything changed when, on June 23rd, Mildred received a phone call stating Aimee was alive and in a Douglas, Arizona hospital. She began to tell a heroic story of kidnap and survival over the previous 6 weeks. She stated that back on May 18th, while on Ocean Park Beach, a couple had come up to her and asked her to pray for their daughter who was in their car. She agreed and followed them to their car, but when they opened the back seat, there was no child. She was forced into the back seat of the car and drugged with something on a rag, which would later be speculated to be chloroform. When she awoke, she was no longer wearing her dress, but wearing a bathing suit, presumably provided by her captives. At first, she was held in a room in what seemed to be an urban city in Mexico. She was taken care of mostly by a woman named Rose, who seemed to have some type of medical understanding. She stated that she believed they were holding her hostage in hopes of a ransom. They tried treating her harshly at first, but they quickly gave up on trying to extract any personal information by force. They soon after moved her to a desert shack in Mexico. But Aimee quickly started a plan to escape from the shack. When the group had left one day, she used a metal can lid to cut the bonds that held her. She then climbed out the back window and started heading towards a mountain she recognized as being north. She explained that she used her clothes to protect her from the desert sun and used the lights of the city in the distance to navigate at night. She eventually found herself in a residence home in Agua Prieta, Sonora. It was the home of R.R. Gonzalez and his wife. They tried to offer her food and drink, but she refused, telling them of the situation she had suffered at the hands of her captors, but altogether seemed out of it. They alerted Presidente Ernesto, who helped transport her to Douglas, Arizona, across the border so that she could seek medical treatment. Once she arrived at the hospital, she once again told the doctors what had happened, and they began treating her for her wounds. They removed some cactus spines from her legs and treated the toes on one of her feet for blisters. The hospital staff, however, did not believe the story that she was this famous pastor, Aimee McPherson. They believed it was just someone using her name to seek medical treatment. She looked emaciated and did not look like the put-together and dressed-up celebrity that the police and members of her church had been presenting to the public when asking for help. Her claims were eventually substantiated when a news reporter positively identified her as the famous pastor who had been missing. Once they were certain it was Aimee McPherson, they called her mother Mildred on June 23rd and informed her that Aimee was safe and in a Douglas, Arizona hospital. Aimee's family rushed to Douglas to be at the side of a recovering Aimee, who was pleased to know that her children and family were all in a safe situation. Once she was able to recover enough to leave, she took a train back to Los Angeles with her family. She was met with up to 50,000 people welcoming her back to LA and celebrated as she made her way back to Angelus Temple. But it wasn't all celebration. In fact, I've just explained the kidnapping story the way that Aimee and her family would explain her disappearance until their passing. However, in her absence, many in the media, government, and other religious groups had taken the time to speak out publicly against Aimee and claimed that her time away was more disingenuous than Aimee would claim. Over the 6 weeks of her being gone, many different scandalous things were said about Aimee. Some claimed that she had went on a rendezvous with a secret lover. Others claimed that it was a spectacle to drum up attention and get money donations. Also, many leaders in the community who did not support the teachings of Aimee, as well as many church leaders who had lost congregational members to the Angelus Temple, began presenting the situation as a play to drum up media attention for her and her new church. When Aimee made it back into town, she began garnering attention from many of these groups. Some believed McPherson was to blame for the incident, and so they said her missing time had been a waste of taxpayers' money and had manipulated the people of LA. The LAPD was frustrated for many different reasons. The first is that the LAPD had publicly stated multiple times that she had drowned. The second was that they had spent a lot of time searching for her body. If, in fact, she had lied and left upon her own free will, it would have cost them a lot of time and taxpayers' money. With the urging of many in the LAPD and city leadership, a grand jury was held on July 8, 1926 to lay the groundwork for her captives to be taken to court. But very quickly it became evident that prosecutor Asa Keys had no real intentions of charging the 4 captives. Rather, he was using the opportunity to publicly question Aimee. He called into account her beliefs, her sanity, her ethics, and tried to get her to admit that the whole story was a lie. They also claimed that she had been a nuisance everywhere she had ever been. To the annoyance of the prosecution, she was able to provide documentation showing the positive impact she had had on all of the community she'd been involved with. Furthermore, there was no actual proof from the prosecution to poke holes in Aimee's story. In the end, the jury found there was no evidence to convict Aimee or the alleged kidnappers behind the event. But things did not stop there. The media continued to push the narrative that Aimee and her family had not been telling the truth about the situation. This narrative exploded in popularity again when a story came out that Aimee was seen with her former employee Kenneth Ormiston in a resort town named Carmel by the Sea when she was supposedly missing. This drove many in the public to presume her guilt in the situation. Many in the city began to take this opportunity to attack Aimee personally from their pulpits, radio stations, and council chairs. Some of the city leaders who did not like what she was doing in the LA area claimed she was a liar and bad for the community. Some churches that lost members due to her new ministry in the city attacked her moral character. Some even took the opportunity to attack her leadership as a woman, saying this is what happens when a woman is in charge of leading a church or large organization. But the public's condemnation led the prosecution to call a second jury trial on August 3rd to prosecute Aimee for falsifying her kidnapping. The main reason they listed was their claim that Aimee had spent time at the resort town Carmel by the Sea with her former employee, Kenneth Ormiston. In the trial, the prosecution brought many witnesses who claimed to have seen her with Kenneth during the time of her alleged kidnapping. Most of the questioning was built around who they referred to as Woman X in the trial. As the eyewitnesses began taking the stand and went through their stories, it began to become very clear that these witnesses were anything but reliable. One claimed that they knew it was her because the woman with Kenneth had bright red hair. When Aimee took her hat off to reveal her gray hair, the woman still claimed it was her. Another, after claiming to see Aimee, agreed that originally she had stated it was someone else. It was not until 75 days later that he went to LA to claim it was Aimee. The last example was one who claimed the woman was 25 with fair skin and blonde hair, and another claimed her to be 40 with dark eyes and dark hair. These are just a few examples, but Aimee and her team would be able to counter every claim the prosecution laid in front of them. They were able to bring reasonable doubt to all of the eyewitnesses' claims. To the frustration of the prosecution team, by the end of the trial, they were once again left with no definitive evidence against Aimee for the claims they were making. But the prosecution was still not done. A woman by the name of Lorraine Wiseman Siloff, who was once a witness for Aimee's defense, changed sides and became the prosecution's new star witness. This time, they submitted a file to try Aimee, her mother, and several other defendants with several different charges adding up to a maximum prison time of 42 years. The prosecution's new star witness, however, did not do much to actually further their case. Her story quickly broke down. She started contradicting her own claims, and after further questioning, even the prosecution marked her as an unreliable witness. This wasn't the only claim that started to fall through. The evidence that they had presented suddenly became missing when required to be presented. The case against Aimee once again fell apart as nothing the prosecution presented against Aimee held up in court. Recognizing this, the prosecution officially dropped all charges against Aimee and her family. Unfortunately, although the charges were dropped, she still had been dragged through the ringers of public perception. It didn't help that because they dropped the case and Aimee did not seek a jury trial to clear her name, anyone could still say whatever they wanted without fear of slander charges being issued. Many would take up this opportunity and would continue to propagate this idea that Aimee was at fault. But Aimee was done with being in courts, and instead, she wrote a book about her whole kidnapping situation titled In the Service of the King, The Story of My Life, in 1927 after the trial had ended. It is notable to say, before we get back to the life of Aimee, that from the very beginning of her time in the Douglas Hospital until the end of her life, she did not change her story. And for many, this is what eventually led them to change their opinions about Aimee and the entire ordeal. But for now, we are going to catch up with Aimee in 1927, when she was able to devote herself completely back to leading the temple. She began leading the church once again, preaching weekly messages to larger and larger crowds. But for a time, the church did have to go into a sort of damage control. Aimee continued to try to pioneer new ways of presenting the message and merge the presentation of secular music, theater, and broadcasting with the more traditional teaching concepts of Christianity. However, over the last couple of years, the church management suffered many difficulties. By the time Aimee was back leading the church every day, many things had changed. The largest of these things had to do with a difference in leadership that Aimee and her mother Mildred had. Mildred had long been a very important part of Aimee's ministry, but when she had taken over for her daughter while she was presumed dead, and then she was in court, she sought to rein in some of the more lavish aspects that Aimee favored. As Aimee attempted to shift back towards the new presentations, they came to an inevitable fork in the road. Mildred believed Aimee's leadership was no longer best for the church, so she attempted to bring up a vote of no confidence against her daughter. Mildred did not get enough votes to change the leadership, but she was able to bring a large amount of people with her when she departed from the church. Aimee and Mildred both agreed to Mildred parting from the church, but that did not mean it was a positive experience for Aimee. She was now responsible for building back up a large part of her upper management. As Aimee built up her new management, they began pursuing different financial projects and investments. Unfortunately, many of these quickly began to deplete the savings of the temple as they became tied up in many different situations. For the next couple of years, they continued to lose money from investments and began to be sued from inside and outside of the church, as well as by her own family. Thankfully, Aimee hired a man by the name of Giles Knight to take over the financial leadership for the Angelus Temple. He would bring the temple out of debt by settling lawsuits, canceling projects, selling off assets, and generally setting up a financially sustainable way of running the church. But although there were some difficulties on the home front of Angelus Temple, the movement had spread so much that it was necessary for there to be a solidification of the movement. So, in December 1927, after Foursquare had established 100 churches, they would incorporate what would become the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, ICFG. At this point, with the group number of organizations being attached to the ICFG, it was important for them to establish the general teachings of the organization, and it was time for Aimee to decide how much of her teachings would become doctrine for the church. She took the opportunity very seriously, and with the help of her leadership and the leaders of the other organizations, they put together their official statement of belief. At this time, I think it's appropriate to take a quick look at what exactly Aimee and the Foursquare Church believed. The first notable thing for the ICFG would be the explanation of their name. The Foursquare Church is in reference to the fourfold ministry of Jesus. First is Jesus Christ the Savior, Romans 10:9. Second, baptizer with the Holy Spirit, Luke 3:16. Third, healer, 1 Peter 2:24. And fourth, coming King, Acts 1:11. This foundation had been there very early on with Aimee's teachings, and it would be the foundational statement for the ICFG as a whole. But going beyond this teaching, the Foursquare Church emphasizes two key ordinances: baptism, which is reserved for adult believers, and the Lord's Supper, viewed as a powerful sign. Central to their doctrine is the absolute authority of the Bible, which they consider infallibly true and the ultimate reference for all matters of faith and practice. Notably, Foursquare churches take a stand against the theory of evolution. This opposition to evolution is rooted in the historical stance of their founder, Aimee Semple McPherson, who publicly challenged human and animal evolution throughout her life. It is important to note, however, that they do not insist on adhering to the young earth system. In matters of salvation, the church follows an Arminian perspective, believing that it is available to all of humanity. Yet, they stress that the benefits of salvation are only attainable through God's grace and faith in Jesus Christ. They teach sanctification as an ongoing progressive experience rather than a distinct second work of grace. Foursquare churches also promote the idea of a separate and distinct baptism with the Holy Spirit, often accompanied by the speaking of tongues as a sign of this experience. They maintain the belief in the possibility of divine healing through transcendent act of grace and focus on prophecy as primary forthtelling rather than foretelling. The church endorses a view that spiritual gifts should be exercised in moderation and holds a premillennial view of the end times. They take a traditional stance on issues related to human sexuality, affirming the marriage is solely between a man and a woman and opposing homosexual activities. They consider divorce acceptable only on New Testament grounds and view abortion as a moral and spiritual evil. Lastly, the Foursquare Church encourages the practice of both tithes and offerings for the support of the church and promote women's ability to minister in any capacity or office within the church. If this is something you're more interested in, follow the links in the descriptions to a PDF version from the Foursquare Church itself, and also the link for a video from the YouTube channel Ready to Harvest, which goes into more detail about some of these beliefs. But Aimee would be faced with a practical theological situation when she began to once again be in the spotlight. In 1932, she married actor and musician David Hutton. It was a large media spectacle that led many to have questions about Aimee's decision. David was living a questionable lifestyle to be the spouse of a church leader. The question became, how would they manage to combine both of their positions in a respectable way? Regardless, Aimee was once again in the spotlight as she accompanied David to many of the shows, events, and parties that they were invited to. Unfortunately, at this time, Aimee took a bad fall and fractured her skull. She needed a bit of time to recover and took the opportunity to visit Europe on her own. It was at this time, however, that the veil of their marriage began to fall. Aimee began seeing more and more photos of David with scantily clad women. She heard that he had been using her name to help get him jobs or into different organizations, and as their names were included more in newspaper headlines, she began rethinking the entire marriage. In 1933, just a year after they married, they officially separated. The next year, in 1934, they divorced. With this being her second divorce and her third husband, her authority began to be questioned. First, the personal scandals began damaging the reputation of the Foursquare Gospel Church. It was another way that insiders and outsiders began to question the authority of her leadership. The concerns that some had about her seemingly blurring the lines between secular and religious were on show during this marriage and divorce. Secondly, theologically, Aimee was in a situation where ICFG said that they only believed in biblical grounds for divorce. This was now the second time she had been divorced, and for the second time she was having trouble using Matthew 5:32 as the grounds for this divorce. Once again, her authority as leader was being questioned, and this time, 32 ministers left the ICFG to start the Open Bible Standard Churches, which would become known as the Open Bible Churches. Aimee would publicly repent from this marriage and said that she would not be attempting to date or remarry going forward, only dedicating herself to her ministries and leadership. Aimee was once again in a situation where she was trying to fix her public image and build back up her following inside of the church. One of the ways she did this was by becoming closely involved with the celebration of the Azusa Street movement. The Angelus Temple would become the place where Azusa Street would celebrate its 30th anniversary. For clarification, the Azusa Street Revival was a historical movement that was led by William Seymour, an African-American preacher. This revival would become the catalyst for what would become known as the Pentecostal movement. This, of course, is the realm of Christianity that Aimee built her ministry in IFCG upon. So, when given the opportunity, it made sense that publicly and personally it would be a perfect opportunity for her to help change things for the better again. This relationship began to draw crowds, and Aimee herself was challenged by the teachings of the group. She began to bring back some of those original teachings that, in the past years, she had begun to give up to help make the services more approachable. Hearing the stories of the electric environment that took place, Aimee decided to start incorporating some of these ideas back into her services. One of the biggest changes was the public speaking in tongues, which Aimee had not done since the early beginnings of the church. This was not new to Aimee. As a reminder, she was someone who practiced the interpretation of tongues when she was part of William Durham's Full Gospel Assembly. This return to more Pentecostal presentations began drawing more and more people back to her church as they felt a more genuine return to some of the core Pentecostal teachings which she had first made a name for herself with. But if her partnership with the Azusa Street Revival was a rebrand for the inside of the church, her next step would be to help change the outside perspective of her ministries. This would come in 1939 when World War II officially broke out. Aimee had originally been a supporter of pacifism for the majority of her life. She openly supported disarmament when the threats of nuclear war were being discussed by major world powers. But in 1939, when World War II broke out, Aimee went full force into patriotic mode. It was said that the temple became an active branch of the government to promote patriotism and the U.S.'s place in the war. One of the main reasons she changed her perspective was that she began to believe the Second World War was going to usher in the apocalypse and that Christ was going to be returning shortly. They began having all-night prayer meetings for the return of Christ and for the end of the war. But it wasn't just through prayers that she began supporting the American government in the war. She began using her position to regularly preach on the importance of helping the government in their war efforts. One of the biggest stunts she did was when she was trying to get people to conserve gasoline and rubber. She drove a horse and buggy down the road all the way to the front door of the temple. She continued when, in 1942, she helped to facilitate the selling of 150,000 war bonds in an hour, which broke a record for the most sold in any 1 hour period. Next, she was able to collect 2,800 pints of blood for the Red Cross. She even opened her broadcasting network to the Office of War Information, who could use it at any time they needed to help spread the news or requests for the American people. To really show the change in her ideals, the crowning moment of her services became the reading of the national anthem. This move towards the total war strategy brought with it more controversies, as some began to question the implicit support that she had shown in the American government. There seemed to be no critical analysis of the war efforts, and for many, it was difficult for them to reconcile total support of America when they were currently creating internment camps for Japanese citizens, as just one example. But for many, this was a shining example of what the American church could do for the government. Although some left over this new teaching, many more newcomers joined during this time. Her work with the government and her support of the military became a major reason for many joining the church. Once again, her services were packed, and she began having more and more services to accommodate everyone. But on September 26, 1944, everything came to a quick halt. Aimee had traveled to Oakland, California to preach a series of revivals. But when she had not arrived that morning, her son Rolf went to check on her. When he finally opened the door, he found her unconscious in the bed. Beside her was a half-empty bottle of capsules. She was officially declared dead, and an autopsy was scheduled to figure out what had happened. The first thing that they had to figure out was where these pills came from and what they were. The pills were identified as sleeping pills, with some of them being identified as the barbiturate secobarbital, which was a strong sedative that had never been prescribed to her. After investigation, they found that she had been trying to call a doctor because she had been feeling ill from her medicine, but she could not get through to him. She had tried multiple times, but she was never able to get a hold of any doctor. She eventually lost consciousness, and the autopsy showed that she had had a heart attack and passed away that night. There was some speculation at first, because of the sleeping pills, that maybe there was a self-harm aspect of the death. But after investigating all the evidence, it seemed that it all pointed toward a heart attack being the cause of death. This unexpected death was a major event in Los Angeles. The funeral procession was huge, and over 45,000 people waited in line to see her. Although her public and private relationship had gone through rocky times, after her death, many would come out and praise all of the good work she had done for her city and for drawing people to Christ. At her funeral were thousands who had been impacted by her life and ministries. She was officially buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in Glendale, California. Aimee Semple McPherson was one of the most popular and publicized Protestants of the 1920s and 30s. Her founding of the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel would spread around the world, and her teachings would reach millions through her media outreaches. Today, the Foursquare Church, which was handed over to her son Rolf McPherson after her passing, now claims a membership of 8.8 million worldwide as of 2022. The impact she had reached outside of just her church walls, impacting both the Christian movement in America as well as many secular organizations in Los Angeles and beyond. Her progressive preaching styles have continued today. Many of her presentations have become commonplace in many megachurches, which they refer to as today. But I think the best legacy that Aimee left was with the quote from Hebrews 13:8 that is required to be in every congregational building today, and that is, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever. Although the form might change, the message never does. Thank you for watching this video. If you are interested in another informative and accessible introduction, why don't you check out this video on the screen now, where we look at Alexander Campbell, another impactful denominational leader in America.